It seems Christopher Nolan was inspired by Odysseus' hubris because he really thought he could improve upon the founding fictional story of Western civilization, when, instead, he ended up butchering it.
Your arrogance blinds you, Master Yoda.
Nolan is one of the best filmmakers of all time, but after seeing the movie this weekend, he was clearly not the right director to tackle the Odyssey. At nearly every turn, it feels like he was more interested in reshaping Homer's epic into reheated Oppenheimer leftovers with modern sensibilities than adapting the actual source material, and the result is a well-made movie that is a terrible adaptation of the fantasy epic.
I smell shit!
Perhaps the biggest change is that Nolan transforms what is fundamentally a mythological fantasy into a grounded historical tale. Rather than embracing the gods, monsters, and magic, the film seems determined to rationalize or minimize nearly all of it. It's one thing to ground Batman and the Joker, it's another to boil down the Greek pantheon to nothing more than thunderstorms.
My disappointment is immeasurable.
Athena is basically the only deity who plays any meaningful role, and even then the movie heavily hints that she's just a manifestation of Odysseus' guilt rather than an actual goddess. Once you notice that choice, it starts to recontextualize everything about the story. The film opens with Odysseus stranded with Calypso while under the effects of the lotus flower, and from that point forward there's a legitimate argument that none of the supernatural events actually happen. The Cyclops, Circe's magic, the sirens, the giants, it can all be interpreted as Odysseus hallucinating or remembering his journey through the haze of trauma and drugs. Even if viewers don't take it this way, Nolan rushes as quickly as he possibly can past these fantasy elements since he is a slave to realism. I think we should have spent more time on the Odyssey itself in the frickin' Odyssey movie.
No, I don't really feel like it.
And even hinting that these elements are fictions of Odysseus' imagination completely changes the genre of the Odyssey. Instead of a mythological epic where gods actively shape the fate of mankind, it becomes a psychological character study where every fantasy element can be explained away. That's not necessarily a bad story in itself, but it's no longer Homer's Odyssey. Not even close.
What is this shit?
The same thing happens with Odysseus himself, who was fundamentally changed as a character. In Homer's version, Odysseus is incredibly prideful. His arrogance is often what creates all the problems in the story. He's clever, resourceful, and absolutely wants to go home. But in Nolan's version, he's consumed by guilt over the Trojan War and wishing he'd never fought in it. Nolan rewrites him into something much closer to an Oppenheimer-style protagonist, a broken war veteran suffering from PTSD whose greatest struggle is living with the consequences of what he did during the conflict. He feels abusing Zeus's law with the Trojan horse tactic will forever reshape humanity for the worse, and his reluctance to return home isn't driven by the obstacles on his journey so much as his guilt and belief that he no longer deserves to return, as he explains to Calypso.
What? What are you talking about?
Homer's Odysseus doesn't spend the story regretting the Trojan War or viewing himself as morally broken because of it. Nolan fundamentally reimagines him through a modern lens, recasting him as a man haunted by guilt and desperate to atone for the past. In doing so, the film often feels like it's judging both Odysseus and the Greeks by contemporary moral standards rather than trying to understand them within the context of the ancient world. Not to mention the modern language and multicultural casting completely breaks the verisimilitude of the story.
Hold up. Wait a minute. Something ain't right.
But back to Odysseus, he's no longer a hero taking on the gods themselves, but a broken man who is ashamed of his toxic masculinity. That perspective is hammered home throughout the movie. The clearest example is Circe's transformation of Odysseus' men into pigs, which the film frames as revealing men's true nature. Moments like that made it feel as though Nolan was repeatedly apologizing for Odysseus as a character, as if he needed to reassure modern audiences that the film understood the flaws of these ancient heroes. And that's not to say I'm pro-war and I think killing and pillaging is justified, but rather these are modern morals that Homer did not have to contend with when writing this story. Homer's Odyssey isn't asking us to view Odysseus through a 21st century moral framework. It's exploring heroism, cunning, hubris, hospitality, and perseverance through the values of its own time. Once you replace those values with modern ones, you're no longer interpreting that story, you're telling a different one. Specifically, you're changing the Odyssey from a heroic hero's journey where a flawed man returns to fulfill his promise to his family and kingdom into a tragedy about the evils of war and the mental anguish that comes from it.
Oh, okay.
Real quick, if you're enjoying the video, please leave a like and subscribe. Now back to the video. The movie also changes the meaning behind Zeus's law in a way that fundamentally alters the moral framework of the story. The film presents Zeus's law as essentially, you must be hospitable unless a person attacks you first. The Trojan horse is shown through the lens of abusing this custom. The horse is presented as a gift and yet is a trick that leads to the destruction of Troy and its people. The film builds this entire mythology that Odysseus' actions during the Trojan War began the collapse of Zeus's law and ultimately broke the world's moral order. And Odysseus, like Oppenheimer, has doomed humanity to repeat this endless cycle of violence. Not only did Homer's Odysseus not regret his actions in the war, but also Zeus's law is portrayed completely different. Zeus's law is much closer to the concept of reciprocity, treating guests and strangers according to how they behave toward you. Hospitality is sacred, but those who abuse it forfeit its protections. That's exactly why the slaughter of the suitors is justified in the original poem. They had spent years abusing Penelope's hospitality, consuming Odysseus' wealth, and disrespecting his household. They weren't arbitrarily protected just because they hadn't attacked anyone yet. By violating every sacred rule of hospitality, they had already earned their punishment in the original poem. That distinction matters because it completely changes the story's moral logic. All of the characters like Odysseus, Telemachus, and the suitors are waiting around to be attacked so that they have justification to kill, when this makes no sense under the framework of Homer's original story.
My brain hurts!
Which brings me to what I think is the film's biggest thematic departure from the original tale. Nolan frames the Trojan War as the beginning of the death of hospitality and turns Odysseus into the man whose actions effectively poisoned the world. It's an almost Oppenheimer-esque interpretation where one man's military brilliance creates consequences that haunt civilization forever. The problem is, this just isn't what the Odyssey is about.
That just makes no fucking sense. I mean, it's just bullshit.
The original poem isn't a story about the psychological cost of war destroying the world's moral order. It's about perseverance, homecoming, identity, temptation, divine intervention, and the relationship between humanity and the gods. War is certainly part of the Odyssey, but it isn't the central philosophical lens through which every event is viewed, and I think that's ultimately why this adaptation doesn't work for me. Nolan didn't just modernize the Odyssey, he fundamentally reinterpreted it. He stripped away much of its mythology, rewrote its protagonists, and replaced the original themes with ones that fit his own interests. You can absolutely make the argument that it's an interesting film, but as an adaptation, it feels like it's telling a completely different story than the source material.
I don't even know who you are.
I also have mixed feelings about the way Nolan structures the story. To be fair, the non-linear editing isn't something that's unexpected. Homer's Odyssey doesn't begin with the fall of Troy either. We meet Odysseus years into his journey, and much of what happened beforehand is revealed through flashbacks. So, on paper, Nolan's decision to tell the story this way actually respects the structure of the original text, but the problem is the execution.
I hope you're hungry for nothing.
The movie drops us into the middle of the story with Odysseus in the land of the Lotus Eaters, if you can even call it that since so much was changed on that location, and then proceeds to jump around so rapidly that there's almost no time to breathe. Every island and every major event feels like it's rushing to get to the next one before you've had a chance to absorb what just happened. And I understand why to a degree. It's an enormous story, and fitting all of this into a single movie was always going to be nearly impossible, but Nolan didn't help himself by choosing to film on IMAX. IMAX films literally can't be longer than 3 hours because of the format. The reels are so large, spanning miles in length and hundreds of pounds, that anything over 3 hours would make them almost impossible to deal with from a logistical standpoint. Christopher Nolan can basically do whatever he wants, and I guarantee if he went to Universal and said, hey, I'm making a 4-hour movie, they wouldn't have even batted an eye. But by filming everything in IMAX, this is now an impossibility and a disservice to the story itself.
It's a bold strategy, Cotton. Let's see if it pays off for him.
And because of this, the result is that the journey rarely feels like a journey. It feels like a montage. One of the greatest strengths of the Odyssey is that you feel the passage of time. Every island represents a new challenge. Every victory and setback slowly wears Odysseus down. Here, the pacing is so relentless that I never really felt like I was traveling with him. Instead, it felt like I was watching highlights, a montage of famous moments from the Odyssey, rather than actually experiencing the Odyssey itself. And one final criticism, my god, the choreography in the final fight was worse than the throne room scene in The Last Jedi. If you know, you know. In conclusion, at the end of the day, I don't think the Odyssey is a bad movie. It's beautifully shot and the performances are pretty good. The score is fine, and technically, it's pretty masterfully made. But my ultimate problem is that almost everything I loved about Homer's Odyssey has either been stripped away or fundamentally reinterpreted. The mythology is reduced to psychological symbolism. The gods become optional. Odysseus is transformed from a prideful, cunning king into a guilt-ridden veteran seeking redemption. The central themes shift from homecoming, fate, and perseverance to war trauma and modern morality. Even the structure and the pacing make the journey feel more like a montage than an actual journey. I don't think Christopher Nolan failed because he isn't a great filmmaker. He clearly is. I think he failed because he was more interested in making the Odyssey into a Christopher Nolan film than making the best possible adaptation of Homer's epic. Instead of trusting one of the greatest stories ever written, he constantly tried to reshape it in his own vision, and that is this film's ultimate failing. Not that Nolan made a bad movie, but he made the wrong one entirely. Thank you so much for sticking with the video this long. If you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. My goal is to hit 5K subs and any help is greatly appreciated. And be sure to leave a comment below. I want to hear your thoughts on the Odyssey. Did you love it? Did you hate it? Are you somewhere in the middle? Were you okay with the changes or did they drive you crazy? How do you think this movie stacks up compared to Nolan's other work? I personally think it's in the middle of his filmography, and I think Inception, The Dark Knight, and others are quite a bit better. But that's just my opinion, and I want to hear yours down below. Again, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it, and I hope to see you in the next one. Until then, may the force be with you always. Take care.